You know that moment when someone you love destroys you so completely that time actually stops? When the words hit you like a physical blow, but somehow you're still standing there, still breathing, still expected to smile and pretend it doesn't matter? That's exactly what happened to me at my own family's dinner table on October 15th, when my father raised his glass in front of 37 guests and called me a worthless freeloader who'd never amounted to anything. But here's the plot twist that would make Hollywood jealous. Exactly 72 hours later, his boss, the CEO of the most powerful defense contracting firm in North America, stood before a room full of Pentagon officials and Fortune 100 executives, snapped to attention, and said, "Good morning, Colonel Mitchell. We're honored to have you lead this operation." My name is Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, and this is the story of how the daughter they erased from family photos turned out to be the person signing their paychecks. Let me paint you the picture of that night that changed everything. I just completed a grueling 14-hour drive from Peterson Space Force Base in Colorado Springs, where I'd spent the last 6 months designing cybersecurity protocols that would protect America's most classified satellite networks. My Jeep Wrangler was caked with mountain dust, my back was screaming from the drive, and I was running on 3 hours of sleep and gas station coffee. But I'd promised my mother I'd be there for what she called Marcus's triumph celebration. So there I was, pulling into the circular driveway of our family's $2.3 million estate in Winnetka, Illinois. The house loomed before me like a monument to everything I'd never quite measured up to. Pristine Georgian colonial with hand-carved stone columns, manicured grounds that required a team of landscapers, and enough square footage to house a small army. The motion sensor lights flickered on as I approached, casting long shadows across the perfectly edged lawn. Even the house seemed to hesitate before welcoming me home. I sat in my car for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, and watched the warm light spilling from the windows. Through the sheer curtains, I could see figures moving around inside, my family preparing for their evening of celebration. For a split second, I felt like an outsider looking in on a life I'd never quite belonged to. The front door opened before I could knock, revealing my mother in all her orchestrated perfection. Patricia Whitmore Mitchell, former debutante, current social architect of Chicago's North Shore elite, and the woman who'd spent 30 years molding our family's image like a sculptor working marble. She wore her signature Chanel suit in navy blue, pearls that had belonged to her grandmother, and that practice smile she'd perfected for charity galas and corporate wives' luncheons. "Sarah, darling," she said, but her arms remained at her sides. No hug, no real warmth, just the kind of greeting you'd give a neighbor you tolerated out of politeness. "We were starting to wonder if you'd gotten lost. You know how unreliable military communication can be." I'd texted her my exact arrival time 3 days ago. She'd responded with a heart emoji. But this was vintage Patricia, rewriting reality to fit whatever narrative served her purposes. "Sorry I'm a few minutes late, Mom. Traffic through the city was brutal." I shouldered my overnight bag, the same battered military duffel I'd carried through 3 deployments. Her eyes fixed on the bag with barely concealed distaste. "Oh, sweetheart, couldn't you have brought something a little more appropriate? We have important guests tonight. The Richardsons, the Blackwells, Senator Morrison's wife. Image matters. You know? It's just an overnight bag. Mom, I'll keep it upstairs." About that, she fidgeted with her pearls, a tell I'd recognized since childhood. "We've had to make some adjustments to the sleeping arrangements. Your old room is now my wellness sanctuary, yoga space, meditation corner, that sort of thing. Very feng shui. You understand? But the guest suite is lovely. Fresh flowers, Egyptian cotton sheets, the works. The guest suite in the house where I'd lived for 18 years, taken my first steps, learned to read, done homework at the kitchen table while she cooked dinner. I was now a guest. "Of course," I said quietly. "The guest suite sounds perfect." As I followed her through the foyer, my eyes automatically scanned the gallery wall that had always showcased our family's milestones. The photos told a story. All right, Marcus's graduation from Northwestern, Marcus shaking hands with Chicago's mayor, Marcus at various charity events and corporate functions. There were pictures of our parents at galas, vacation shots from the Hamptons, even photos of our golden retriever, Bailey, who died when I was in college. What there wasn't was a single image of me in uniform. Not my commissioning ceremony at the Air Force Academy, not my promotion to major, not the photo of me receiving the Distinguished Service Medal for my work on classified defense systems. It was as if my military career, 15 years of my life, had simply never happened. The dining room took my breath away, but not in a good way. It had been transformed into what could only be described as a shrine to Marcus's corporate success. Professional photos of him in power poses dominated the space, Marcus delivering presentations, Marcus receiving awards, Marcus looking pensively out of corner office windows like a Fortune 500 cover story. The dining table, expanded to accommodate what looked like at least 40 people, was set with our family's most precious heirlooms, the Waterford crystal that had been passed down through 4 generations, the sterling silver that came out only for weddings and funerals, and enough white roses to stock a florist shop. But what really caught my attention was the professional staging area set up near the bay windows, a mahogany podium with built-in microphone system, a massive flat-screen display for presentations, and professional lighting that could have been borrowed from a television studio. This wasn't a family dinner. It was a production worthy of a TED Talk. I walked slowly around the table, reading each place card written in Patricia's careful calligraphy. The seating arrangement told its own story. Marcus at the head of the table naturally, with his fiancée Rachel to his right and our parents flanking them in positions of honor. The remaining seats were filled with names I recognized: Northwestern alumni, partners from Richardson and Associates, city council members, and various pillars of Chicago society. I circled the table 3 times, checking every single card. My name wasn't anywhere. "Mom," I called toward the kitchen, where I could hear catering staff preparing what smelled like a 5-course meal. "Where exactly am I sitting tonight?" Patricia emerged carrying a crystal vase filled with white orchids. Her expression suddenly flustered. "Oh, sweetheart, we had a bit of a mix-up with the final head count. You know how these corporate events can be, very last-minute RSVPs and such. And just grab any chair that's available when dinner starts. Maybe something toward the periphery so you don't accidentally block anyone's view of Marcus's presentation. Toward the periphery. Like I was a wedding crasher, trying not to draw attention." "How many people are we expecting?" I asked. 43 confirmed, plus a few possibles. It's quite the gathering. Marcus's promotion to senior vice president is really making waves in the consulting world. They're saying he could be the youngest partner in Richardson and Associates history. 43 people coming to celebrate my brother's success, and not one of them needed to worry about where Sarah was sitting, because Sarah didn't officially exist at this event. As the guests began arriving, I retreated to the kitchen and watched my family transform into their public personas. My father, Robert Mitchell, emerged from his study wearing his power uniform, custom-tailored Armani suit, Italian leather shoes, and the confidence of a man who'd built a commercial real estate empire from scratch. He worked the room like a politician, firm handshakes and booming laughter, making sure everyone knew that Marcus's success was a reflection of superior Mitchell family values. Patricia floated through the gathering like a professional hostess, air-kissing wives, complimenting outfits, and making sure every guest felt seen and appreciated. She had that supernatural ability that wealthy women develop, the skill to make small talk that somehow made everyone feel like the most important person in the room. And then there was Marcus himself, absolutely glowing in the spotlight. At 32, he'd inherited the best of both parents, Robert's natural charisma and Patricia's social intelligence, wrapped up in the kind of classic good looks that made him perfect for corporate headshots. Tonight he wore success like a well-tailored jacket, moving through the crowd with the easy confidence of someone who'd never doubted their place in the world. "Sarah," a voice called from across the room. I turned to see Janet Henderson approaching with a confused smile. Janet had lived next door for 20 years and had hosted my high school graduation party. "I almost didn't recognize you. Remind me what you're doing these days." Before I could answer, Patricia materialized beside me like a social media handler. "Oh, Sarah's been bouncing around different career paths. You know how millennials are, always exploring, always searching for that perfect fit. We keep telling her that stability is important, but..." She let the sentence hang there with a helpless shrug, as if my life choices were a source of gentle but persistent family concern, bouncing around different career paths. I was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Air Force with 2 master's degrees, one in computer science from MIT and another in international relations from Georgetown. I had top-secret security clearance that took 5 years to obtain. I designed cybersecurity systems currently protecting classified satellite networks worth $2.8 billion. I testified before congressional committees about national security threats. I'd been personally briefed by 3-star generals and had my recommendations implemented at the highest levels of government. But to my mother, I was just a confused millennial who couldn't figure out what she wanted to be when she grew up. "That's interesting," Janet said politely, clearly unsure how to respond. "Well, I'm sure you'll find your path eventually." The real show began at 8 o'clock sharp when Marcus took his position behind the podium. The room fell silent with an attentiveness usually reserved for TED Talks or presidential addresses. He'd always been comfortable with attention, but tonight he commanded it with the authority of someone who genuinely earned his moment. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice carrying perfectly through the professional sound system. "When Richardson and Associates offered me the position of senior vice president, I knew I wanted to celebrate with the people who matter most: family, friends, and the mentors who've shaped my journey." The slideshow that followed was nothing short of masterful storytelling. Marcus had clearly invested serious money in professional presentation design. Each slide was gorgeously crafted, with cinematic transitions and a soundtrack that belonged in a documentary about American success stories. We watched Marcus the Scholar, graduation photos from Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management, Dean's List certificates, academic achievement awards. Then came Marcus the Innovator, early career highlights, groundbreaking consulting projects, testimonials from grateful clients. Finally, Marcus the Leader, team-building retreats, conference presentations, industry recognition awards. The narrative was flawless. A brilliant young man who'd identified his talents early, worked tirelessly to develop them, and was now reaping the rewards of his dedication and vision. The audience was completely captivated, hanging on every word as Marcus explained his revolutionary approaches to corporate restructuring and his paradigm-shifting methodologies in strategic consulting. I found myself genuinely impressed despite everything. Marcus had always been smart and ambitious, but this presentation revealed a level of professional sophistication I hadn't expected. He spoke with the confidence of someone who genuinely mastered his field, referencing complex business theories and case studies with the ease of a tenured professor. But then came slide 24, and the world stopped. It was a group photo from 4 years ago, taken in the conference room at Marcus's first major client presentation. I remembered that day with perfect clarity because it had been one of the most stressful weeks of my life. Not because of my own work, but because of the frantic phone calls I'd been getting from Marcus at all hours. His startup consulting firm was hemorrhaging money. He'd landed a potential client that could save the company, but he needed $400,000 in immediate capital to demonstrate financial stability and fund the initial project phase. His business partner had bailed. His bank had refused the loan, and he was 72 hours away from having to shut down everything he'd worked for. I'd been in the middle of a classified briefing about Chinese cyber threats when my phone buzzed with his text, "Sarah, I'm about to lose everything. I know I have no right to ask, but you're the only person I know who might be able to help. I need $400,000 by Friday or it's over." I'd excused myself from the briefing, called my financial advisor, and liquidated a significant portion of my investment portfolio. The money had hit Marcus's account with 6 hours to spare. In the original photo from that presentation, I'd stood in the left corner of the conference room, wearing my favorite charcoal blazer and the vintage Omega watch that had belonged to my grandfather. My hand had been resting on the whiteboard where Marcus had sketched out his innovative consulting framework, a framework that was actually based on military strategic planning principles I'd taught him during late-night phone conversations. But in the photo Marcus was showing tonight, I simply wasn't there anymore. The image had been professionally edited, cropped and adjusted so seamlessly that no one would ever guess there had been another person in that room. The only trace of my existence was a thin sliver of my blazer's sleeve, visible at the very edge of the frame, and even that was so subtle you'd have to know what you were looking for to spot it. I sat perfectly still, my wine glass frozen halfway to my lips as applause thundered around me. Marcus continued his presentation, describing that pivotal moment as his breakthrough solo presentation that established my reputation in the industry. He talked about the months of preparation, the innovative strategies he'd developed, the courage it had taken to bet everything on his vision. Solo presentation. I watched 43 people give him a standing ovation for erasing me from his origin story, and not one of them had any idea what they were really applauding. The presentation continued with Marcus's subsequent successes, client wins, team expansions, industry awards. Each achievement was presented as the natural result of his talent and determination, a linear progression of well-deserved victories. The timeline was perfect, the narrative was inspiring, and every single detail that might have complicated the story of Marcus the self-made success had been carefully edited out. "Now," Marcus said as the slideshow concluded, "I want to take a moment to thank the people who made tonight possible. First and foremost, my incredible fiancée Rachel, who planned every detail of this beautiful evening." The room erupted in appreciative applause. Rachel stood gracefully, accepting the recognition with the poise of someone accustomed to public acknowledgement. She looked stunning in emerald green silk, her blonde hair perfect, her smile radiant with happiness and pride. I stared at her, waiting for some acknowledgement of the truth we both knew. 3 weeks ago, Marcus had called me in a panic. The promotion to senior VP came with certain expectations, the kind of celebration dinner that would impress his new partners and their spouses. Between his new Porsche payments and the down payment on his Lincoln Park penthouse, he was stretched beyond his limits. Could I possibly help with the catering costs? Maybe around $25,000 to ensure everything met Richardson and Associates standards. This would bring my total financial support over 4 years to $847,000. I'd wired the money that same day, with one simple request. Could we keep this between us? No need to create awkwardness or make Marcus feel like he owed me anything. Family helps family, right? The money had gone through Rachel's account to keep it discreet and preserve Marcus's dignity. She'd coordinated with the caterers, approved the menu, selected the wines. To everyone in this room, she was the generous, thoughtful fiancée who'd single-handedly created this magical evening. To Rachel, I said quietly, raising my glass along with everyone else, for making this beautiful celebration possible. Her eyes met mine for just a fraction of a second, long enough for me to see the apology there, the discomfort, the knowledge that she was accepting credit for my generosity. But the moment passed without acknowledgement, without correction, without truth. The dinner continued with toast after toast, each one adding another layer to the Marcus Mitchell legend. I listened to colleagues describe his innovative thinking, friends praise his loyalty, mentors claim credit for recognizing his potential early. With each story, I felt myself becoming more transparent, more invisible, until I wondered if I might simply evaporate into the perfect North Shore air. But then my father stood up, and the entire energy of the room shifted like a storm front moving in. Robert Mitchell commanded attention the way some people commanded armies, with absolute authority and the unshakable confidence of someone who'd never been wrong about anything that mattered. At 64, he still cut an imposing figure, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that made restaurant hostesses scramble for the best tables and business rivals think twice before challenging him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades in Chicago's most exclusive boardrooms. "Tonight we celebrate more than just my son's promotion. We celebrate the vindication of values that seem to be disappearing from our society." The room fell completely silent. Even the catering staff paused in their movements, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Robert continued, his gaze sweeping across the assembled guests with deliberate intensity. "In a world full of participation trophies and unearned rewards, Marcus represents something precious, genuine achievement through genuine effort. He's proven that success still goes to those who work for it, not those who wait for handouts." My stomach dropped. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly fascinated by their dessert plates. The air itself seemed to thicken with tension. "You see," Robert's voice grew stronger, more pointed. "There are 2 types of people in this world. There are the builders, the ones who create value, who take risks, who earn their place through blood, sweat, and determination. And then there are the others, the ones who coast along on other people's efforts, who expect to be carried, who mistake family obligation for personal achievement." The silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. No one moved. No one breathed. Everyone in that room understood exactly what was happening, even if they didn't know the specific details. "Marcus has never asked for a handout," Robert continued, his eyes finding mine across the table. "Never expected anyone else to solve his problems or subsidize his choices. He's built everything he has through his own talent, his own vision, his own willingness to do whatever it takes to succeed." I felt something break inside my chest, not dramatically, not with sound or fury, but with the quiet finality of a bone snapping cleanly in 2. My father was using his son's celebration dinner to publicly humiliate his daughter, and he was doing it in front of 43 witnesses who would carry this story into Chicago's social circles, like a virus. "Absolutely right, Dad," Marcus chimed in, his voice carrying that nervous edge I remembered from childhood whenever he was caught between loyalty and self-preservation. "There's no substitute for hard work and personal responsibility. That's what separates the achievers from from everyone else." The approving murmurs that rippled through the room felt like physical blows. These people, many of whom I'd known since childhood, were nodding along with my family's assessment of my worthlessness. They were comfortable with this narrative. It made sense to them. I stared down at my untouched crème brûlée. watching the candlelight flicker in the caramelized sugar, and realized with crystal clarity that this wasn't a spontaneous moment of cruelty. This was planned. This was deliberate. This was my family's way of finally saying out loud what they'd apparently been thinking for years. "Let's not let this get too serious," Patricia interjected with forced lightness, but her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "This is Marcus's night. After all, we should keep the focus on celebrating his incredible achievement." Marcus's night. It was always Marcus's night, Marcus's moment, Marcus's spotlight. And my role, apparently, was to sit quietly in the shadows and absorb whatever casual cruelty they felt like dispensing. I nodded silently, not in agreement, but in something else entirely, something cold and sharp and absolutely certain. As the conversation moved on to safer topics and the dessert course continued, I excused myself quietly and stepped into the hallway that had been the backdrop for so many childhood memories. The laughter and animated conversation continued behind me, a warm bubble of contentment and mutual admiration that I would never be invited to join. I pulled out my phone and opened the encrypted application that connected me to my actual life, the one my family had decided didn't exist. Tomorrow's schedule was already loaded. SATE-100, Defense Contract Review Board, Pentagon Annex, 1000, Military Civilian Integration Protocol Briefing, ANA 1300, Congressional Subcommittee, Testimony on Cybersecurity Threats, and there, highlighted in red at the top of my classified agenda, Principal Advisor Latine Colonel Sarah E. Mitchell, Cybersecurity Division, United States Air Force, C. Security Clearance, Top Secret SCI, Project Lead, Operation Digital Shield. They had absolutely no idea who they were talking to. They literally had no concept of what I actually did for a living, how much responsibility I carried, or how many people's lives depended on the systems I designed and the decisions I made. I stared at the screen for a long moment, the blue glow reflecting off the gallery of family photos that documented every milestone in Marcus's life while managing to completely erase mine from the official family history. In those carefully curated images, I simply didn't exist as anything more than an occasional background presence. From the dining room, I could hear Marcus wrapping up his presentation to thunderous applause. Patricia was already talking about dessert wines and after-dinner cocktails. Robert was holding court with a group of business associates, probably sharing wisdom about the importance of personal accountability and the dangers of enabling underachievers, I whispered to myself, so quietly that even the house itself couldn't hear. Tomorrow, we're going to find out exactly who's been freeloading. And for the first time in 15 years, I smiled a smile that had nothing to do with family harmony and everything to do with the kind of justice that comes with perfect timing and classified security clearance. 3 days later, the morning arrived with the kind of crisp October clarity that makes Chicago look like a postcard, all golden light and autumn leaves dancing in the wind. But I wasn't admiring the scenery as I drove my dusty Jeep through the gleaming corporate district toward Richardson and Associates' flagship tower. I was thinking about the phone call that had woken me at 6:15 a.m. 3 days after the dinner. Colonel Mitchell, the voice had been urgent, professional. "This is General Harrison's aide. We need you at the Richardson meeting today. There's been a development in military speak that usually meant someone had screwed up badly enough to require immediate intervention. I'd known this day was coming for 3 months, ever since Richardson and Associates had bid on the largest cybersecurity contract in Department of Defense history, a $2.8 billion project to overhaul the Pentagon's entire digital infrastructure. What I hadn't known was that my own brother worked for the company that was about to discover they'd been building their entire proposal on stolen intellectual property. my intellectual property. As I pulled into the visitor parking garage of Richardson's 47-story glass monument to corporate success, I caught sight of a familiar black BMW sedan in the executive section. My father's car. He'd apparently been invited to this morning's presentation as Marcus's guest, a proud father getting to witness his son's crowning achievement. Perfect timing. I sat in my Jeep for a moment, looking up at the tower that stretched into the Chicago sky like a steel and glass middle finger pointed at the clouds. Somewhere in that building, Marcus was probably rehearsing his presentation one final time, adjusting his tie, running through the talking points that would supposedly cement his reputation as a consulting visionary. Somewhere else, my father was probably networking with Richardson's partners, dropping casual mentions of his son's brilliance and his family's values. Neither of them had any idea that in exactly 93 minutes, their entire understanding of reality was about to be demolished. I opened my phone and scrolled through the secure files I'd compiled over the past 72 hours. The digital trail was devastating in its completeness. Bank records showing Marcus's firm had received $847,000 in angel investments from my personal accounts over the past 4 years. Email exchanges where I'd provided him with strategic frameworks originally developed for military applications. Code repositories showing that the revolutionary software Richardson was preparing to demonstrate had been adapted from classified systems I'd designed for the Air Force. Most damning of all was the security audit I'd run on Richardson's internal networks 2 days ago. Marcus had been accessing classified documents through a back door in their system. Documents he had no authorization to view, let alone use as the foundation for a multi-billion-dollar proposal. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. "Hope you got home safely last night, sweetheart. Thank you for being there for Marcus's big moment. Family means everything. Family means everything." The irony was so sharp it could have cut diamond. I locked my phone, grabbed my briefcase, and walked toward the elevator that would take me to the 42nd floor, where Richardson and Associates was about to experience the most expensive education in corporate ethics in their company's history. The elevator doors opened directly into Richardson's executive reception area, a space designed to intimidate and impress in equal measure. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Lake Michigan, while the walls displayed awards, accolades, and photographs of the firm's partners shaking hands with senators, governors, and Fortune 500 CEOs. Everything about the space screamed power, success, and absolute confidence. The receptionist, a perfectly groomed woman in her 30s who probably had an MBA from Northwestern, looked up as I approached. Her smile was professional but puzzled. I clearly wasn't what she'd been expecting. "Good morning," I said, setting my briefcase down and reaching into my jacket pocket. "Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, United States Air Force. I'm here for the Department of Defense presentation." I handed her my military identification, watching as her expression shifted from confusion to something approaching awe. The DoD had sent a full-bird colonel to evaluate their proposal. This was bigger than anyone had anticipated. "Of course, Colonel Mitchell, we're honored to have you here." She was already reaching for her phone. "Let me notify Mr. Richardson that you've arrived." "Actually," I said, checking my watch, "I'd prefer to observe the preliminary setup. I understand there's a family member of one of your consultants here as well." "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Robert Mitchell. He's Marcus Mitchell's father. Marcus is presenting the cybersecurity framework this morning." "Perfect. I'd like to introduce myself before the formal presentation begins." She led me through a maze of glass-walled conference rooms and open-plan workspaces, where junior consultants hunched over laptops, analyzing data and building PowerPoint presentations that would determine the fates of Fortune 500 companies. The energy was electric. This was a firm that thrived on high-stakes problem-solving and million-dollar decisions. We found them in the executive conference room, a space that could double as a television studio. Marcus stood at the front, resplendent in what looked like a $3,000 suit, adjusting slides on a massive 85-inch display. My father sat at the polished mahogany table, looking every inch the successful businessman in his navy Armani and Italian leather shoes. They were deep in conversation about market positioning and competitive advantages, their voices carrying the easy confidence of men who'd never doubted their place in the world. Marcus was explaining something about paradigm-shifting integration protocols, while Robert nodded approvingly and offered insights about leveraging synergistic opportunities. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching this tableau of masculine success and family pride. They looked so comfortable, so certain of their narrative, so completely unprepared for what was about to happen. "Excuse me," I said, stepping into the room. They both turned, and I watched their faces cycle through the same sequence of emotions: mild curiosity, growing confusion, and finally dawning horror as they recognized me. "Sarah?" Marcus's voice cracked slightly. "What are you doing here? And why are you dressed like—" He gestured vaguely at my Air Force service dress uniform, dark blue jacket with silver buttons, ribbons indicating 15 years of distinguished service, and the silver oak leaves that marked my rank as Lieutenant Colonel. "Like what, Marcus?" I asked, walking further into the room and setting my briefcase on the table with deliberate precision. Robert found his voice first, though it carried none of its usual authority. "Sarah, what's going on? Why are you wearing that costume?" Costume? Even now, even faced with evidence they couldn't deny, they were still trying to diminish what they were seeing. "Good morning, gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying the crisp professionalism I'd learned in 15 years of military service. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, Principal Cybersecurity Advisor to the Department of Defense. I'm here to evaluate Richardson and Associates' proposal for the Pentagon's digital infrastructure overhaul." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the building's HVAC system humming 42 floors above the street. Marcus's face had gone pale except for 2 bright spots of red on his cheeks. Robert was staring at me like I'd just announced I was an alien from another planet. "That's impossible," Marcus whispered. "You're not. I mean, you can't be." "Can't be what?" I asked. "Successful? Accomplished? Important enough to hold top-secret security clearance and advise Congress on national cybersecurity policy?" Before either of them could respond, the conference room door opened and David Richardson himself entered, followed by his senior partners and what looked like half the firm's executive team. Richardson was exactly what central casting would order for a corporate power player: silver-haired, expensively suited, with the kind of presence that made other powerful people defer to his judgment. "Colonel Mitchell," he said, extending his hand with genuine respect, "we're deeply honored to have you here. Your reputation in cybersecurity circles is legendary." "Thank you, Mr. Richardson. I'm looking forward to seeing what your team has developed." As the room filled with Richardson's people, I watched my father and brother struggle to process what they were witnessing. The woman they dismissed as a directionless failure was being treated with the kind of deference usually reserved for foreign dignitaries. Senior partners who'd built their careers on reading power dynamics were clearly recognizing that I was the most important person in the room. "I believe you know Marcus Mitchell, one of our rising stars," Richardson said, gesturing toward my brother. "And this is his father, Robert Mitchell, who's been generous enough to join us this morning." "Actually," I said, allowing myself a small smile, "we're already acquainted. Marcus is my younger brother." The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Richardson's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Several partners exchanged meaningful glances, and I could practically see them recalculating the political dynamics of their entire presentation. If the DoD's evaluation officer was related to their presenter, this changed everything about how the morning would unfold. Marcus looked like he was about to be sick. "Sarah, I don't understand what, Marcus? How I became a lieutenant colonel, how I earned 2 master's degrees, how I designed the cybersecurity protocols currently protecting 18 different classified military networks?" I opened my briefcase and removed a thick folder marked with Department of Defense seals. Or how I discovered that the revolutionary framework you're about to present was adapted from classified systems I designed 3 years ago. The folder hit the table with a sound like a gavel falling. Every person in that room understood that something seismic was happening, even if they didn't yet grasp the full scope of the disaster. Richardson's voice was carefully controlled. "Colonel, perhaps we should discuss this privately before—" "No," I said firmly. "I think it's important that everyone hear this, especially since we're talking about a $2.8 billion federal contract and potential violations of both intellectual property law and national security protocols." I opened the folder and began laying out documents with the methodical precision of someone who'd prepared for this moment for months. Bank records showing financial transactions between my accounts and Marcus's firm, email chains where I'd provided strategic guidance that had been incorporated into Richardson's proposal without attribution. Most damning of all, server logs showing unauthorized access to classified Department of Defense systems from Richardson's internal network. These records show that over the past 4 years, I've provided $847,000 in direct financial support to Marcus's consulting firm, I said, my voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. I've also provided strategic frameworks, technical guidance, and access to classified research that forms the foundation of the proposal you're preparing to present to the Pentagon. Marcus was shaking his head frantically. "Sarah, that's not... yes, you helped financially, but the intellectual work was mine. The frameworks, the innovations, were adapted from military systems I designed under classified contracts," I interrupted. "Systems that are currently protecting critical infrastructure for the United States Air Force, the National Security Agency, and the Defense Intelligence Agency." I pulled out another document, a printout of computer code that made several of Richardson's partners lean forward in their chairs. "This is the source code for what you're calling your revolutionary adaptive security protocol. Notice the header comments that identify it as property of the United States Air Force, authored by Lieutenant Colonel S.E. Mitchell, classified under Project Digital Shield." I looked directly at Marcus. "Project Digital Shield is so classified that most generals don't have access to it. How exactly did you obtain this code, Marcus?" The room had gone so quiet I could hear traffic noise from 42 floors below. Richardson and his partners were staring at Marcus with expressions of growing horror as they realized their star presenter had built their biggest proposal on stolen classified material. Robert finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Sarah, sweetheart, there must be some mistake. Marcus would never..." Marcus accessed classified Department of Defense servers using a backdoor in Richardson's network, I said, pulling out the final piece of evidence, a detailed security audit that showed every unauthorized intrusion. "He's been downloading classified documents for 8 months, documents that form the basis of approximately 60% of your proposal." The implications were sinking in now. Richardson's face had gone ashen as he realized his firm was facing potential criminal charges for handling stolen classified material. His partners were already reaching for their phones, probably calling lawyers and crisis management specialists. But I wasn't finished. "There's something else you should know," I said, addressing the room but keeping my eyes locked on my father and brother. 3 weeks ago, Marcus called me requesting $25,000 to help pay for a celebration dinner. Last night's dinner, to be specific. The dinner where my father publicly called me a freeloader who'd never accomplished anything of value. I reached into my briefcase one final time and pulled out a bank statement showing the wire transfer to Rachel's account. I paid for the dinner where my own family humiliated me in front of 43 guests. I paid for the celebration of achievements that were built on my work, my money, and my classified research. I stood up slowly, my uniform giving weight to every word. So I have to ask, who exactly is the freeloader in this family? The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Marcus was staring at the table, his hands trembling slightly. Robert looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past 10 minutes. Several of Richardson's partners were quietly slipping out of the room, probably to begin damage control procedures. Richardson cleared his throat, his voice carefully professional despite the catastrophe unfolding in his conference room. Colonel Mitchell, what would be the appropriate next steps from the Department of Defense's perspective? I collected my documents and returned them to the folder with military precision. Mr. Richardson, I'll be recommending that the DoD suspend all contract negotiations with your firm pending a full investigation into security breaches and potential espionage. I'll also be referring this matter to the FBI's Cybersecurity Division and the Inspector General's office. Richardson nodded grimly. He was a smart enough businessman to know when a situation was beyond salvage. As for you, Marcus, I said, turning to face my brother directly. You have approximately 6 hours before federal investigators arrive to seize your computers and begin building what will likely become a criminal case for theft of classified material. I'd suggest you call a very good lawyer. Marcus finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate. Sarah, please. I never meant for any of this to happen. I was just trying to build something, to prove myself. To prove yourself? The words came out harder than I'd intended. You built your entire career on stealing my work and taking credit for my innovations. You let our parents treat me like a failure while you collected awards for achievements that wouldn't exist without me. You erased me from your own origin story and then had the audacity to call me a burden. I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back one final time. Oh, and Marcus? That revolutionary framework you've been presenting to clients for the past 2 years? The one that launched your reputation as an innovative thinker? I designed it in 2019 as part of a classified project to protect military communication networks from Chinese cyber attacks. Every time you've presented it as your own creation, you've committed a federal crime. As I reached for the door handle, Robert called out, his voice breaking slightly. Sarah, wait, please, can we talk about this privately as a family? I turned to look at him, this man who'd raised me, who'd taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework and walked me down the aisle at my college graduation. This man who'd stood in front of 43 people last night and called me worthless. Mr. Mitchell, I said, using the formal address I'd reserved for any civilian in an official capacity. I tried to talk to this family for 15 years. I tried to share my accomplishments, my challenges, my life. But you were too busy celebrating Marcus to notice that I'd built a career protecting the very freedom that allowed you to build your real estate empire. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, where I could see Richardson's assistants already making frantic phone calls and sending urgent emails. The next few hours were going to be very interesting for everyone involved. The United States Air Force doesn't negotiate with security threats. I called back into the conference room, even when they're related to me. As I walked toward the elevator, I could hear the conference room erupting into urgent, desperate conversation behind me. Plans being made, lawyers being called, damage control strategies being developed. But it was too late for all of that. The elevator doors closed with a soft chime, and for the first time in 24 hours, I was alone with the enormity of what had just happened. I just destroyed my brother's career, my father's pride, and probably my family's relationship with me forever. And somehow, I felt lighter than I had in years. 6 months. That's how long the silence lasted after the Richardson and Associates scandal became front-page news in every major business publication, from the Wall Street Journal to Forbes. 6 months of my phone not ringing, my inbox staying empty of family emails, and my mother's Christmas card arriving addressed simply to current resident at my Colorado Springs apartment. 6 months of blessed, terrible peace. The fallout had been swift and merciless. Within 72 hours of my revelation in that conference room, the FBI's cybersecurity task force had seized every computer, server, and storage device in Marcus's apartment and office. Richardson and Associates had lost not only the $2.8 billion DoD contract, but also 3 other major clients who decided they couldn't risk association with a firm under federal investigation. The company's stock price had dropped 34% in a single day, and David Richardson himself had been forced to step down as CEO. Marcus had avoided federal charges, but only barely. His lawyer, one of Chicago's most expensive criminal defense attorneys, had negotiated a plea deal that required him to cooperate fully with the investigation, pay $2.3 million in fines, and accept a 10-year ban from handling any government contracts. He'd also been quietly terminated from Richardson and Associates, along with 4 other consultants who'd been implicated in the security breaches. The most satisfying part, though, had been watching the story evolve in the media. What started as a corporate espionage scandal had gradually revealed the deeper narrative of family dysfunction and stolen valor. Some enterprising journalist at the Chicago Tribune had dug into the background and discovered that the brilliant young consultant at the center of the scandal had a sister who was not only a decorated Air Force officer, but also the actual author of the intellectual property he'd stolen. The headline that made it all worthwhile: Local real estate mogul's daughter exposed brother's theft of her classified military innovations. Robert Mitchell's business reputation had survived, but his social standing in Chicago's elite circles had taken a devastating hit. Nothing destroys North Shore social currency quite like being exposed as the father who publicly humiliated his war hero daughter while celebrating his criminal son. During those 6 months of family silence, I'd been busier than ever. The Pentagon had fast-tracked 3 of my cybersecurity proposals. Congress had requested my testimony on protecting critical infrastructure, and I'd been selected to lead a joint task force with the CIA on emerging cyber threats. My security clearance had been upgraded to a level so classified that I couldn't even tell my closest friends what I did during the day. I'd also been promoted to full colonel, the youngest woman in Air Force history to achieve that rank in cybersecurity operations. The ceremony had been attended by 2 generals, a congressional delegation, and my mentor from the academy, but no family. I'd stood there in my dress blues, accepting congratulations from some of the most powerful people in national security, and felt completely alone. Which is why I was so surprised when my doorbell rang on a Tuesday evening in April, and I opened it to find all 3 of them standing on my front porch. They looked smaller somehow. Robert's shoulders weren't quite as square. Patricia's smile wasn't quite as confident, and Marcus appeared to have aged 5 years in 6 months. He was thinner, his expensive clothes hanging slightly loose on his frame, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Hello, Sarah," Patricia said, her voice uncharacteristically tentative. She was holding a covered dish that smelled like her famous lasagna. and Robert carried a bottle of wine that probably cost more than most people's car payments. Marcus stood slightly behind them, empty-handed but freshly shaved, wearing what looked like genuine humility for the first time in his adult life. "We were hoping," Robert began, then stopped and cleared his throat. "We were wondering if you might have a few minutes to talk." I looked at them standing there on my modest front porch, this family that had spent decades making me feel inadequate and unwanted, now seeking an audience with the daughter they'd dismissed as worthless. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh, but instead, I stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Come in." My apartment was nothing like the family home in Winnetka, where their house was all marble surfaces and museum-quality artwork. Mine was comfortable and lived in. Military commendations hung on the walls alongside photos from deployments and training exercises. My bookshelves were filled with technical manuals, strategic studies, and the kind of dense academic texts that had shaped my understanding of global security threats. They took it all in with obvious surprise. I don't think any of them had ever really considered what my life looked like when I wasn't trying to fit into their world. We sat in my living room, the silence stretching uncomfortably until Patricia finally spoke. "Your apartment is lovely, sweetheart. Very purposeful. Purposeful." Even now, she couldn't quite bring herself to use words like impressive or accomplished. "Thank you," I said. "Can I get anyone coffee? Water?" "We're fine," Robert said quickly, then seemed to realize this wasn't his house or his meeting to control. "I mean, whatever you think is best. I made coffee anyway, partly because I needed something to do with my hands, and partly because I wanted them to sit with their discomfort for a few extra minutes." When I returned with mugs and cream, they were examining the framed photo on my side table, me with General Harrison and 2 senators, after my congressional testimony on cybersecurity threats. "Is that really you?" Marcus asked quietly. "In the Pentagon, briefing the Senate Intelligence Committee on Chinese cyber warfare capabilities," I confirmed. "That was 3 months ago. The recommendations I made that day are now part of official U.S. defense policy." Marcus stared at the photo like it was written in a foreign language he couldn't quite decipher. We drank our coffee in silence for several minutes before Robert finally gathered the courage to speak what they'd all come to say. "Sarah," he began, his voice carrying none of its usual authority, "we owe you an apology, a profound apology, for many, many things." I waited. I'd learned the power of silence in military negotiations. Sometimes the most important thing you could do was let the other party fill the void with their own admissions. "We didn't know," Patricia added, her hands twisting around her coffee mug, "about your work, your achievements, your importance. We had no idea what you were really doing." "You never asked," I said simply. The words hung in the air like an accusation, which I suppose they were. "You're right," Marcus said, speaking for the first time since they'd arrived. "We never asked. We made assumptions about your life, your choices, your value, and we never bothered to question whether those assumptions might be wrong." I studied his face, looking for signs of the calculated charm that had always been his trademark. But what I saw instead was something I'd never seen from Marcus before: genuine remorse. "The worst part," he continued, "is that I knew, deep down, I knew that everything I'd accomplished was built on your foundation. The money, the ideas, the connections, none of it would have existed without you. But I convinced myself that I'd earned it somehow, that I deserved credit for having the vision to use your resources effectively." He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "The night of the dinner. When Dad called you a freeloader, I should have stood up. I should have told everyone in that room about your sacrifices, your generosity, your brilliance. Instead, I sat there and let you be humiliated because it was easier than admitting the truth about my own success. Robert was nodding slowly, his eyes fixed on his hands. I spent 30 years building a business based on the principle that hard work and integrity matter more than anything else. Then I stood in my own dining room and attacked my daughter's character while celebrating achievements that wouldn't have existed without her support. The irony, he continued, his voice breaking slightly, is that you were the one living by the values I claimed to represent. You were the one earning your success through talent and dedication. You were the one serving something bigger than yourself, and I was too blind to see it. Patricia was crying now, quiet tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. "I've been thinking about something you said that night," she whispered. "About how if we'd known what you were really doing, we would have told you to stop." She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "You were right. We would have told you to find something safer, more conventional, more manageable. We would have tried to make you smaller to fit our limited understanding of what success should look like." The admission hung between us like a bridge. Neither of us was sure we wanted to cross. "We saw the newspaper articles," Robert said. "The ones about the Richardson investigation, about your role in exposing the security breaches. One of them mentioned that you'd been protecting classified satellite networks worth billions of dollars. Another said you'd designed cybersecurity systems that were preventing foreign attacks on American infrastructure." He paused, shaking his head in what looked like wonder. "My daughter, the daughter I called a burden, has been protecting our entire country from threats I couldn't even imagine. And instead of celebrating that incredible service, I was worried about what the neighbors would think of your unconventional career path." Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping. It was the front page of the Chicago Tribune from 2 months ago, featuring a photo of me receiving the Distinguished Service Medal from the Secretary of Defense. The headline read, "Chicago native honored for extraordinary service in cybersecurity defense." "I carry this with me," he said, unfolding it carefully, "every day. It reminds me of how spectacularly wrong I was about everything that matters." He handed me the clipping, and I was surprised to see that the edges were worn from handling, as if he'd read it dozens of times. "I've been going to therapy," he continued, "trying to understand how I became someone who could steal from his own sister and then convince himself he was the victim when she finally fought back. The therapist says I have what she calls entitlement narcissism, the belief that I deserved success regardless of how I achieved it." The clinical terminology sounded strange coming from Marcus, who'd always preferred to explain away his problems rather than examine them. "I've also been attending a support group for people who've committed white-collar crimes," he said. "Most of them are there because they convinced themselves that rules didn't apply to them, that they were too smart or too special to face consequences. I recognized myself in every story they told." We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 3 decades of family dysfunction settling around us like dust. Finally, I spoke. "Do you want to know the hardest part about all of this?" I asked. It wasn't the humiliation at dinner or even discovering that Marcus had stolen my work. It was realizing that you'd all decided who I was without ever bothering to find out who I was becoming. "Warren," I stood up and walked to my bookshelf, pulling out a photo album I'd kept hidden for years. I brought it back to the coffee table and opened it to the first page. "This is my commissioning ceremony at the Air Force Academy," I said, pointing to a photo of me in my dress blues, young and proud and hopeful. "You were supposed to be there, but Dad had a business emergency and Mom didn't want to travel alone." I turned the page. This is me receiving my first promotion to captain. I called to tell you about it, Mom, and you said that was nice, but did I know that Marcus had been featured in Northwestern's alumni magazine? Another page. This is my team after we successfully defended a military communications network from a coordinated Chinese cyber attack. 17 hours of straight work, preventing what could have been a catastrophic breach of national security. I saved this photo because I wanted to show it to my family, but I never got the chance because every conversation was about Marcus's latest client or Dad's newest development project. I kept turning pages, showing them a decade and a half of achievements they'd never celebrated, milestones they'd never acknowledged, a career they'd never bothered to understand. The saddest part, I said, closing the album, is that I would have loved to share all of this with you. I wanted you to be proud of me. I wanted to be the daughter who made you excited to tell people what she did for a living. Patricia was sobbing now, her careful composure completely abandoned. We are proud, she managed between tears. We're so incredibly proud, and we're so ashamed that it took a public scandal for us to realize what we'd been missing. Robert nodded emphatically. Sarah, what you've accomplished, what you've sacrificed for our country, it's extraordinary. You're extraordinary. And we failed you in every possible way by not seeing it. I looked at these three people who'd shaped my childhood, influenced my insecurities, and inadvertently motivated my drive to succeed. They looked genuinely broken by the recognition of what they'd lost through their own blindness. I don't need your approval anymore, I said gently. I spent too many years trying to earn something that should have been given freely. I've learned to validate my own worth through my work, my service, and my impact on the world. Marcus flinched as if I'd slapped him. But, I continued, I haven't stopped loving you. Even after everything that's happened, you're still my family. The question is whether we can build something real going forward, based on truth instead of the comfortable lies we've been telling ourselves. Robert leaned forward, hope flickering in his eyes. What would that look like? It would mean no more pretending that Marcus built his career independently. It would mean acknowledging that my work has value even if you don't understand it. It would mean treating me like an equal family member instead of a charity case who occasionally shows up for holidays. I paused, making sure they understood the weight of what I was saying. Most importantly, it would mean that, if we're going to have a relationship, it needs to be based on who we actually are, not who we wish we were or who we think we should be. Patricia wiped her eyes and looked at me with something I'd never seen before, genuine respect. Can you forgive us? She asked. I know we don't deserve it, but can you find a way to let us try to be the family you deserved all along? I considered the question seriously. Forgiveness wasn't something I took lightly, especially when the wounds ran as deep as these did. I can forgive you, I said finally, but forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean going back to the way things were. If we're going to rebuild this family, it has to be on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. Marcus nodded quickly. Whatever it takes, I'll do whatever it takes to earn back your trust. It's going to take time, I warned them, and it's going to require changes from all of you. No more dismissing my career as a phase, no more treating me like the family failure, no more erasing me from your narratives when it's convenient. Done, Robert said immediately. All of it, whatever you need. I smiled for the first time since they'd arrived, not the polite smile I'd perfected for family gatherings, but a real smile that came from genuine hope. In that case, I said, let me show you what I actually do for a living. I spent the next 2 hours walking them through my career, explaining cybersecurity in terms they could understand, showing them commendations and photos and documentation of work that had genuinely protected American lives and interests. I watched their faces as they began to comprehend the scope of what I'd accomplished and the magnitude of what they'd failed to see. By the time they left, something fundamental had shifted between us. We weren't the same family we'd been that morning, and we definitely weren't the family we'd been 6 months ago. We were something new, something built on truth instead of comfortable fiction. As I watched their car disappear down my street, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, genuine optimism about my family's future. 3 months later, I stood in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, receiving the Air Force Cross for extraordinary heroism in cyber operations, specifically for preventing a Russian attempt to hack American power grid systems. The ceremony was attended by the Secretary of Defense, 4 generals, and a congressional delegation. It was also attended by 3 civilians who sat in the front row and applauded louder than anyone else when my name was called. My father had tears streaming down his face. My mother kept whispering, "That's my daughter," to anyone who would listen. And Marcus held up his phone to record every moment, already planning to post it on social media with the caption, "My sister, the American hero." After the ceremony, as we walked through the Pentagon corridors together, Robert put his arm around my shoulders, something he'd rarely done even when I was a child. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I need you to know something. You were never the problem in our family. We were. And you becoming the person you are today, that's despite us, not because of us." I stopped walking and turned to face him. "Dad," I said, "I became who I am because you taught me that hard work matters, that integrity matters, that serving something bigger than yourself matters. You just never realized you were teaching me to apply those lessons outside the narrow definition of success you'd imagined for me." He smiled through his tears. "I love you, sweetheart. I'm proud of you, and I promise to spend the rest of my life making sure you know it." As we walked out of the Pentagon together, past the memorials to American heroes, under the flags of all 50 states, through the corridors where the most important decisions in national security are made every day, I realized that redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about choosing to build something better with the time you have left. Today, my family knows exactly who I am and what I do. They know that their daughter and sister has dedicated her life to protecting the freedoms they take for granted. They know that the woman they once called a freeloader is actually someone whose work enables their entire way of life. More importantly, they know that respect isn't something you wait to receive. It's something you earn through your actions and then carry with you, regardless of whether others choose to acknowledge it. To anyone watching this who's ever been underestimated, dismissed, or written off by the people who should love you most, your worth isn't determined by their ability to see it. Keep building, keep achieving, keep serving whatever cause calls to your heart. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving them wrong. It's becoming so secure in your own value that their opinions become irrelevant. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, they eventually grow wise enough to see what was always there.